Hello and welcome to another Enrichment with the Gifted Guy. What I'm going to be talking about today is finding a good Stephen King book. So the first question we need to answer is, who is Stephen King? You've probably heard the name if you've not read a book of his. He's been around for many years, and that he started writing in 1974, which was when I was 2 years old, and he continues to write to this day. He's got a book coming out later this year. So he's a very prolific writer. In that time he's written 60 novels, amongst other smatterings of writings as well. And I purposely choose Stephen King because he is one of the few writers that is both an excellent writer and an excellent storyteller at the same time. So what I mean by that is there are authors that are really entertaining, but they're not real great writers. And there's a lot of great writers whose books are not necessarily very entertaining. They can be dry or boring or difficult to get through. Stephen King walks the tightrope between the two of those, and he is an excellent writer, and he tells excellent stories that are really engaging, and he'll be remembered hundreds of years from now, kind of like he's our Edgar Allan Poe. And so what I want to do is share some of the books that you can't go wrong with a Stephen King book in a lot of cases. Most of his books are really good, but I'm just going to highlight a few of the ones that I think are his best books, and the reason why I feel like they're his best books. So, like I said, he started writing in 1974. From 1974 to 1983, he wrote 8 books. And these are his early books, and you can't go wrong with any of these. These are Carrie, Salem's Lot, Shining, Cujo, Christine. These are all really good books, very good books. I would not consider them great books. I think Stephen King, like most authors, was just starting to get his footing as being a writer. The more that you write, what tends to happen is you get better as a writer. And what eventually happens with a lot of writers is their first few books are good, and then they kind of hit this sweet spot. And Stephen King hit his sweet spot from 1983 to 1987, which is a 4-year period where I felt he wrote his best books. One of these books would be the book Pet Sematary. Pet Sematary is the story of this family that moves to a town, and the kids and the locals tell them about this pet cemetery that is up in the woods. And when you go to this pet cemetery, it's spelled differently than a regular cemetery because kids have created this pet cemetery. And there are legends that when you bury something in the pet cemetery, it comes back to life. And lo and behold, their family cat dies, gets hit. Their house is near a highway, so it's very dangerous, and it gets hit by a car or a truck, and they take it up to the pet cemetery and they bury it, and it comes back to life. But the cat is not the same. It's less friendly than it once was. It hisses at everything. So there's something definitely off about this cat. And the reason why this book is so good is Stephen King does an excellent job at tapping into people's fears and what their greatest fears are. And it's very entertaining to be scared. When he was asked in interviews what his biggest fear was, it was that something would happen to one of his children. And so what eventually happens in this book is his fear come to life, which is that the protagonist, one of his children, gets hit by a truck on this highway, this dangerous highway. And being desperate, this father takes his child up to the pet cemetery and buries this child, hoping that the child will come back. But you have to be careful what you wish for, because when he does come back, he is not the same child. He's actually pretty evil. So that's the lesson learned, is kind of be careful what you wish for. And then madness ensues. But this is an excellent book. Another book from the sweet spot period is It. And you can see it is a very sizable book. I think it's one of his longest books. And it is an excellent story there. No matter how long it is, it moves along very quickly. It was what made me fall in love with Stephen King as a writer. Like I said, Stephen King is good at finding what you're scared of, and so the particular antagonist in this book, which is a creature called Pennywise, can turn into whatever your greatest fear is. So if your greatest fear is bats, he's going to turn into a bat and attack you. If your greatest fear is a Frankenstein monster, he'll turn into that and attack you. And his natural form is a clown, and he lives in the sewers. And you may have seen one of the two movies that came out in the last few years. But Pennywise being a clown would be my biggest fear. I am afraid of clowns, which is what drew me to this book, because I like to be frightened. And so the book is really divided into two parts, just like the movies are, where at the beginning of the book it is about the young kids, and they're kind of running across Pennywise and battling him, and then he goes away, but he comes around every 30 years or so. And so he comes back, and as adults they come back to try to get rid of him for good. And that's the story, is this story of these kids trying to figure out how to battle Pennywise, and as adults coming back and finishing the job. So excellent book, very engaging. A third book from this sweet spot is the book called Misery. Stephen King and a lot of authors do this, write books about authors, because that's what they know. They are authors. And so the premise behind this one is there's an author. He has written a very popular series of books, and it's made him very rich. The problem is he doesn't like this character, and he hates writing these books. This happens in real life sometimes. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote the Sherlock Holmes tales, couldn't stand that character and actually killed him off at one point because he didn't like him. Agatha Christie, who wrote mysteries, one of her most famous one of her famous characters, Poirot, she couldn't stand writing. She thought he was pretentious and didn't like to write. So this protagonist kind of goes to the same thing, where he's tired of this character, so he writes a book where he kills her off. Her name is Misery. And he kills her off, and he's just written the book, and keep in mind this was before there were computers, so he has one hard copy he typed on paper, and it's all the copy he has. And he puts it in his car, and then he goes out into the snow, and his car goes off the side of the road, and he breaks he injures himself, and he's saved by a woman named Annie Wilkes, who brings him to her house. She tells him that she's his biggest fan, but she's a little quite not there. She's a little unhinged, and so even though she's very sweet and she's a nurse and she brings him back to health, she also threatens him at times. So when she finds out that he has killed off her favorite character, she gets very angry and upset, and she's not letting him call anyone. She's kind of trapped him here, and she's not letting him get out. And so he's kind of trapped in this house, getting better, and she's forcing him to rewrite the book, only Misery doesn't die this time. And so she actually burns his old manuscript completely, and then makes him start from scratch and writing a new Misery book. Then what happens eventually is he tries to figure out how to get out of her her house, and how to get away from her. But excellent book. The nice thing about this and the book I'm going to talk about in just a second is there's really no supernatural elements to this. Like in Pet Sematary, there was a cemetery that brought people back to life. And Christine, there was a haunted car. And Cujo, there was this dog that was, and so in Shining, there were ghosts. But in this one, there's no supernatural aspect to it. There's just this woman who's just a little unhinged, and this author who's kind of having to deal with that, which is what makes it so good. After his sweet spot period, he wrote a few books, and I felt he wrote his best book, and that is called Gerald's Game. This is my very favorite Stephen King book. It's not very long. It's kind of lean, which is what I like about it, in that it tells the story of this couple that go up to a remote cabin, and they're like couples do when they go away. They're going to be intimate with one another, and so he handcuffs her to the bed. And then he does something that she doesn't like, and she kicks him, and he ends up having a heart attack and dying right there. And so she is stuck, handcuffed to this bed. They have not told anyone they were going to this cabin. No one knows they're there. She has no way of getting hold of anyone because she can't reach her phone. And so she has to figure, the whole the crux of the book is her trying to figure out how to get out of this situation. And these are my favorite types of books, where where a character paints themselves into a corner, and then they have to come up with inventive or innovative or creative ways to get out of this situation, and that's what she has to do. So Gerald's game, so it's basically told from her perspective, and it's all about her trying to get out of being handcuffed to this bed and to escape. So that is Gerald's Game. Another book I'm going to highlight is Stephen King's really interesting. When Stephen King was writing, it was kind of frowned upon for an author to come out with more than one book in a year. Nowadays, James Patterson is bringing out 8 books in a year. But back when he was first starting writing, it was kind of frowned upon. So he decided to write some books under another name, the name of Richard Bachman. And he wrote, the ones in this one are Road Work, and The Running Man, and the other one, which is Rage. And then the one that's in here that are collected in this is The Long Walk. And The Long Walk is the one I'm going to recommend. The Long Walk is kind of the Hunger Games before the Hunger Games came about. And the idea here is that young people have to walk in this race. And if you go under a certain amount of, a certain pace, then you're killed. And so what eventually happens is only one person will be left. And so it's about this, the protagonist is someone who is walking in this race and trying to be the one that lasts the longest. And I really enjoyed the book. And it's again, there's nothing really supernatural about it. When he wrote his Richard Bachman books, they were less supernatural and more kind of gritty books. And The Long Walk is one of his best Richard Bachman books. He wrote a couple of Richard Bachman books after all these series of books, but by that time everyone knew that he was Stephen King. So those are his Richard Bachman books. Stephen King has a series called The Dark Tower, and The Dark Tower is kind of his Lord of the Rings, where it's a sci-fi story that takes place with a gunslinger in an alternate world, and he brings in people from different worlds, like some from Earth and some from different places, and he's trying to find the Dark Tower, and that's why it's called the Dark Tower series. And this one is the 5th book, called The Wolves of Calla. This series in general is not my favorite. I'm not a huge sci-fi fan, or like Lord of the Rings type story fan. So it's not my favorite series, but this book in particular I really enjoyed. Thought it was really well written. The pacing was really well done. And to be honest with you, the first 5 books of the Dark Tower series are pretty good books. The 3rd one's also good. This was the best of the bunch, I thought. The last 2 books I didn't think were very good. They felt rushed, and they didn't feel like they were as finely crafted as the earlier books. And the reason being is that in 1999, there's another period of Stephen King's writing. In 1999, he was hit by a car. He was walking along the road and he got hit by a car and broke a lot of bones, was on pain meds, couldn't write, couldn't even, he's lucky to have lived. And after that accident, he had written the first 5 books to the Dark Tower series, and after the accident, he wanted to get the last 2 out quickly because he wanted to do it before, because you kind of weigh your humanity and your mortality when something like that happens to you. And so he wanted to get them written before something happened to him, and so they feel kind of rushed because of that. And I will say many of his books after post 1999. He's got a lot of good books, but not a ton of great books in this period. Like I said, his sweet spot was that right after his earlier books from 1983 to 1987. So one book that is recent that is a pretty good book is called Finders Keepers. And this is his Bill Hodges trilogy. So he has 3 books. The first one is Mr. Mercedes. The second one is this one, and the third one is called End of Watch. This is the best of those 3, I felt. And this is, again, there's no supernatural elements in this one. The third one, there become supernatural elements, which kind of made the book not as good as the other ones. But it's more a police procedural. So you have this guy, Bill Hodges, and he used to be a cop, and now he works cases. And in this case, there is an author who, years before, there's a famous kind of legend. J.D. Salinger supposedly, after writing Catcher in the Rye, wouldn't write any more books and release them publicly, but he still wrote, and he would take these books and he'd put them in a drawer in a vault, and no one would have access to these. And so that's kind of the legend. So that's kind of what this is that an author has written books, he's been stowing them away, someone breaks into his house and steals the books, and then and kills him, and then years later the person that did this gets out of jail, and they're trying to find the books, but some kids have stumbled across it. And so it is a kind of a police procedural book, and it's really well done, really finely crafted. Another book that I'm going to recommend is called Skeleton Crew. Stephen King is a prolific short story writer in addition to his novels. He's written over 200 short stories. And he has a couple of these volumes. He has The Night Shift, he has Nightmares and Dreamscapes, he has Everything's Eventual. This is my favorite of the collections. It has two stories in particular. One is The Mist, which was made into a movie and a television show. And it's pretty well done. It's a longer, it would almost be considered a novella, but it's in the short story collection. And then my very favorite from this is called Mrs. Todd's Shortcut, which I think just was a really well done short story. So Skeleton Crew is a really good one. If you don't want to read like whole book length, you can pick up one of his short story collections and just read some of his short stories a little at a time. Stephen King is also famous for doing novellas. And a novella is a book that's not a short story and it's not a novel. It's in between there. And so what he would do is he would write those novellas and then release them in collections. So this is 4 different, in each one you have the summer, the winter, and so on and so forth. And so the 4 novellas that are in this one consist of Rita Hayworth and The Shawshank Redemption, which is Shawshank Redemption, if you've seen that movie. So that's what it's based off of. And it's almost exactly like the movie. I'll say it was really well written, and it became a really good movie. At Pupil, which also is a movie, which I never saw, but the story is really good. It's about a kid who stumbles across a guy who was actually a Nazi during World War II, and he's now living in the United States, and this kid befriends him and kind of their relationship, and it's really interesting. There's one called The Body, and that's what the movie Stand By Me is based off of. And this is about 4 kids who decide, they've heard that this kid got hit by a train and they want to go see the body. And so it's about them going to try to go see this body. And it's a real, again, no supernatural elements to it. It's just the bonding of these kids and about these kids. And then the last one is The Breathing Method, which is kind of the weakest of the 4, but still really good. He had other novellas as well. His other novellas during this time, or that he's done in his career, were Hearts in Atlantis, 4 Past Midnight, Full Dark No Moon. Those all are 4 novellas collected into one book. The last book that I'm going to recommend as being really, really good is one called The Green Mile. And again, this was turned into a popular movie, but The Green Mile is about this prison guard who there's a inmate, this very large man who's an inmate who is accused of killing 2 girls, and he's been put into jail for that, and his name's Coffee. And it's about this, they find out that he actually has the power to heal, and he actually was trying to heal these girls rather than kill them, and he's found with them holding their dead bodies, but he couldn't heal them because they were already dead. But he was blamed for it, and he got put in prison. And it's a really well told tale. It does have those supernatural elements a little bit, but it's more character driven, which is what Stephen King's really good at. But the reason why I really like this book in general is when it first came out, Stephen King's kind of an experimental guy. He's willing to try new things. And so what he did was he put out these smaller versions. So he wrote this Green Mile, which was only about 100, I think it was like 90 some pages long. And so he put this out, and then you could wait a few weeks, and then the second book would come out. And by the way, when he put this first book out, the ending wasn't written of the book yet. So you were seeing him write it as it went along. So he would write this book, and then it would come out, and then he would write a little bit more of the book. And this is what Charles Dickens used to do back when he was a writer. He would serialize his books. He would print them in magazines or newspapers a little bit at a time, and then at the end he would collect them into one book. And so Stephen King did this too. He went through this third one, And then it was so much fun for me every few weeks going to the store and getting a new continuation of the story. So I really enjoyed that experience, as well as the book being so good. So this is the sixth one of these. And so you can't find them in these small versions anymore. You can only find this big version that I showed you. But I still remember that memory, and I really enjoyed that. And it also beckons to his willingness to try different things. And I've always appreciated that about Stephen King, is that he doesn't just sit on his laurels and write the same things, because he could essentially write anything and it would sell. He's always challenging himself, he's always pushing himself, and so I admire him greatly as a writer. A book I'm going to talk about, because it's kind of the book he's most famous for, but it's not one of my favorites. It's a really good book, but it's just not one of my favorites. It's known as The Stand. And The Stand is about a super flu that goes through the whole world and kills most of the population. And then the only people that are left are kind of this good side and this evil side, and they're fighting against one another for kind of to see who gets control of the world. And it's a really, really well done. And again, it plays to his strength of creating really interesting characters, which is what I really enjoyed about it, is that he created these really interesting characters that you wanted to follow. Another book I want to point out, because he's also, in addition to experimenting with different formats, he also likes to write books with people. So Peter Straub, who's also is a big author, and he wrote this book called The Talisman. And what they did was Stephen King would write a few chapters and then send it to Peter Straub, and then he would write a few more chapters and then send it back to Stephen King, and he would write a few, and it went back and forth, and then they would revise, and eventually you had this book. And it's a really, really good book, and you can, even though it's written by two different people, the voice stays fairly consistent, and so, but it was really well done. They even did a sequel to it called The Black House. He's written a book with both of his sons. Both of his sons are authors, and one of his sons, he wrote one called Sleeping Beauties, which came out recently, which is about all the women in the world fall asleep and they can't wake up, and if they do wake up, they're incredibly violent, and so what to do about that. So, but he does like writing with people and collaborating, which is again another really interesting aspect of Stephen King. What I'm going to close with are 5 books that if I were you, I would avoid. They're not necessarily, a couple of them are bad books. The other ones are not necessarily bad, but they're not really that good either. So the first one I want to point out is The Colorado Kid. Again, Stephen King is kind of experimental. And so what happened was this hard case, which was, there used to be books like this back in the 50s and 60s, and Stephen King grew up reading these and he really loved these. They would come out every month or so, they'd have a new hard case, and they decided to kind of revisit it and bring it back, and they asked him to write a story, and so he wrote the story called The Colorado Kid, which was kind of like a noir tale with no supernatural elements to it at all, but it didn't have a clear-cut ending, so it was kind of unsatisfactory for that reason. It's not a great book. It's not a terrible book. It's not a bad read. It's just not a really good one. He also wrote this book called The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon, which is a shorter book. It's almost a novella. It's barely 200 pages long. And the reason why this actually is a really good book at first. It has a really interesting premise where a girl goes off the trail with her mom and her sibling, and she gets lost in the woods, and she's a younger girl, and she has to survive in the woods. You read about this in the papers all the time, people going off trail and getting lost and being found several days later or weeks later or whatever, and this is kind of her tale. The reason why I have it in my ones to avoid is Stephen King is really good at the supernatural, but I feel sometimes he uses it when he doesn't need to. So in this particular book, it's an interesting premise where this girl is, in the wilderness. She has to figure out how to survive. And yet he put some supernatural elements into it that I don't think were necessary, and kind of pulled away from the story of this girl's survival. So that's why it was a disappointment to me. Another book that had a great premise but just did not go anywhere was called Cell. And the premise here is that when people's cell phone would ring and they'd answer it, they would turn into like these mindless zombies and attack people. And so it was kind of an interesting premise because everyone has cell phones, and how do you combat that? But the story itself wasn't well executed. Like, the story didn't reached a satisfying climax, or it wasn't that interesting to follow, to be honest. This is definitely a case of the premise was much better than the actual story itself. This one just didn't really go anywhere. A fourth one that you should avoid is From a Buick 8. And this is not a bad book. It's just not as good as his other car book. So this is about a car. When you open the trunk, it's like an interdimensional, and there are creatures that come out of it. And so it's kind of a supernatural element with a car. Stephen King earlier in his career wrote a book called Christine about a haunted car. It's way better than this. So the reason why I recommend avoiding this is I would read Christine before I would read this. And that this is not executed as well. It's not as interesting. The characters aren't as interesting as they were in Christine. The last book that I'm going to suggest that you avoid is a bad book. It's one of the few bad books that I feel he has written. It's called Rose Madder. And the premise of the story is there's a woman who is abused by her husband, and she tries to escape him, and he's a police officer. And he catches up with her later on in the book. But then there's this whole aspect of a magical painting where things come to life, and it kind of lost me by the time. And it's another case of it had an interesting premise, and then he throws the supernatural in there, and it kind of wrecks the story. But I think my biggest bone to pick with this particular book is the characters are not well written. Stephen King is excellent at writing really good characters. This one I felt not. I felt like all of these characters were stereotypes. I felt like they were right out of a bad movie, and so they were not developed as he has in other of his books. So those are books for Stephen King that I would read, recommend reading. You can choose your own, explore yourself, but I would definitely recommend reading a Stephen King book, and if you like that one, trying another, because I've been reading him since I was in high school, which was 30 years ago, and I'm still reading him, and I still enjoy his books, and his books are timeless. You can read one from 30, 40 years ago, and it doesn't feel dated at all. And so I would pick up a Stephen King book and read it.